Hi there, my name is Ron S. Friedman. I'm a science fiction writer and an IT professional. Welcome to Science Sci-Fi, connecting the public to science and technology through storytelling. Today, we will do something a little bit different than usual. A series of two videos about the space race. This week, we'll talk about the space race in the 1950s and the 1960s, the original space race, and provide some historical background. Next week, I'll do a video about the new type of space race, Space Race 2.0, that takes place right here, right now, in this decade. This new space race that can, within a couple of decades, revolutionize human civilization, making us a spacefaring civilization. On a separate topic, I started to work on an intro for this channel. Let me know in the comments what you think about it. Now, let's proceed with the presentation. As we said in the intro, this will be a two-part video. Part one, this part we're going to talk about the space race, the original space race from the 1950s and 1960s. And in part two, next week, we are going to talk about Space Race 2.0, what happens right here, right now, in this moment. But before we're going to talk about the space race, the original space race, we're going to do a little bit of historical background. From the dawn of aviation, we saw a continuous progress from airplanes that were very, very slow, couldn't fly very high or for a very long distance, to a better, stronger, faster, that could travel to a longer distance, to a higher altitude, get faster to their destination, and eventually we go to spacecraft. So this was a continuous progress. In 1903, we saw the first flight, the Wright brother. It was a pretty small airplane, maybe big wings, but it couldn't fly very high, only a few meters above ground, and couldn't fly very fast, and it only flew for a few hundred meters. In 1909, only 6 years later, we had the first flight that crossed the English Channel. 1919, we had the first transatlantic flight. 1927, the first solo continuous non-stop transatlantic flight. That's the famous Charles Lindbergh flight that captured the media attention. 1939, we had the first airplane that had jet engines, the Hinkel 178. And then came World War II. As much as I hate Nazi Germany, they do deserve the credit of sending the first object, the first man-made object to space. They did it by launching the V2 rocket. That's the rocket you see here on the right side. And it flew over 100 kilometers in heights. That's the Kármán line that defines the border between Earth's atmosphere and space. So officially, the Nazis were the first to reach space. Additionally, during the war, it was one of the most devastating wars in history, but science continued to progress. We see here the Meteor. It's a British jet airplanes. The Germans also had a jet, they had the Messerschmitt Me 262. And by the end of the war, the Soviets captured the eastern side of Germany, and the Allies, the US, Britain, and France, captured the western side of Germany. The Soviets and the Americans, they took the German scientists that work on the space program, on the rocket program, to the Soviet Union and to the US. The picture here at the bottom is von Braun. He was one of the leaders of the German rocket program. And later on he joined NASA, and he was the main architect of the Apollo program. And so the Cold War begins. In the picture here, we see Churchill that gave the famous from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic speech about the Iron Curtain. What happened after World War II is most of the superpower collapsed and stopped being a superpowers. The Japan Empire collapsed and Japan was conquered by the US. Germany was defeated and divided. France was initially conquered by Germany, and it stopped being a superpower. The British Empire was on the brink of bankruptcy. It no longer had the power to project itself. It was no longer a superpower. The only remaining superpowers were the United States on one side and the Soviet Union on the other. Also, these two superpowers represented two different ideologies. The Soviet Union represented communism, and the United States represented democracy. You see here on the map the area of influence between communism and democracy. Now, both superpowers realized that doing an actual war was going to be extremely devastating to both nations, especially after the invention of nuclear weapon. So what happened, they try to find other avenues, other ways to compete with each other. They do it in small proxy war, but this competition between the two superpowers and the two ideology is also the basis, the motivation behind the space race. But before the space race officially started, we still have some progress. Like aviation didn't stop by. In 1947, we have the first airplane, the X-1, that reached Mach 1. That's the speed of sound, the famous Chuck Yeager. So we had an airplane flying faster than the speed of sound. 1953, the first Mach 2 flights. 1957, first intercontinental ballistic missile. This was the Soviet missiles. And then came the moment that just caught everyone by surprise. Sputnik I. On October 4th, 1957, the first artificial satellite is launched into space. And it remains in space. It went into orbit around Earth. It means it didn't fly down. It means the Soviets had the constant eye that could fly over the US. The United States, America was in shock, didn't know what to do. And so the space race begins. Things didn't look good for the United States. The Soviets were leading. 1957, the first dog in space, Laika. That's right after Sputnik. 1958, the first United States was able to send the first satellites. Now, in this slide, I use the color red to point out a Soviet milestone and the blue color for an American milestone. Let's continue. 1959, the first impact into another celestial body, the first time we had a spacecraft that were able to crash into the moon. It was the Soviet Luna 2. 1960, first animal returned alive from space, the Sputnik V. That was a significant milestone because it means perhaps it will be possible to launch people to space and return them back to Earth safely. 1961, now it's an American achievement, first chimpanzee in orbit. They wanted to do something better than the Soviet dog. That's part of the Mercury program. April 12, 1961, first human to reach space, Yuri Gagarin. Huge milestone, huge victory to the Soviet space program. The first astronaut went to space and come back to Earth alive. May 5th, less than a month later, but still trailing behind. First American went into space, Alan Shepard. Later we had the first planetary flyby, the first time a spacecraft from Earth managed to reach close proximity to another planet, Venus, a Soviet one. Then we had the first crew mission lasting over a day. That means it's not just you fly into space and return after an hour or a few minutes, but this time they stay in orbit for a few rounds, complete day. That's the Vostok 2, 1962. First dual crew space flight. Now the Soviet, again, they were winning. They had two people in space at the same time. Things didn't look very good to the United States. The Soviets were able to lead continuously, and the Americans were not able to catch up. That leads JFK, John F. Kennedy, to do the "we won't choose to go to the moon" speech. the United States decided to commit its resources, and into a program so huge that was considered up until then science fiction. The goal was within the end of the decade, we are talking about 1962, that's mean before 1917, to send a person, a human, from Earth and land that person on the moon and then return that person alive and safe back to Earth. This was a huge commitment, and the United States committed itself to that. It committed a huge amount of resources, nearly 5% of the US federal budget, and it has a goal, it had a purpose, and it wanted to defeat the Soviet Union in the space race. But we are not there yet. That was 1962. 1962-3, the Soviets will continue to lead. First 2 women in space. And then they had the first time that the spacecraft was able to stay 5 days, 5 continuous days in space. 1964, first multi-person, a crew of 3. Now the Soviets had 3 people in space, in one spacecraft. Again, a Soviet victory. 1965, March 13, first spacewalk. The first time an astronaut was able to, with an EVA suit, leave the spacecraft and do a spacewalk. Extravascular activity. June 3rd, first American spacewalk, not very far behind. And then the first Mars flyby. What the Soviet did in Venus, the Americans were able to do in Mars a couple of years later. And then they had the first rendezvous in space. No docking, just the spacecraft coming close together, the Gemini 6 and 7. 1966, again, the Soviets are leading. First soft landing on the moon, Luna 9. And the first impact into another planet, Venus. This is, they already did it on the moon one time, now they are managed to crash land on a planet, Venus. By late 1966, finally, the Americans started to lead in the race. Now, it was not yet an American victory, but the first direct ascent rendezvous and the first artificial gravity experiment, that's on the Gemini 11. They managed to connect 2 spacecraft, the Gemini 11 and the early part of the Saturn V. It was not called Saturn V yet. And they managed to rendezvous, and also they managed to connect them with a tether, with a cable, and rotate them and create artificial gravity. This experiment had not been repeated since 1966. But at this point, the Americans had the light advantage over the Soviets. 1968, now we have the fully fledged Apollo program, the first human spacecraft to orbit the moon. This is a huge distance, 385,000 kilometers from Earth. It's not a spacecraft that's flying in orbit 500 kilometers above Earth. We're talking 385,000 kilometers. 1969, again, a Soviet victory. First crew exchange in space. We have 2 spacecraft meeting in space. That's the image here on the right. And the crew was able to walk or float between the 2 spacecraft. A Soviet minor victory before the big moment. The moment we've all been waiting for. The highlight of the space race. The climax. The moon landing. This was one of the most important moments in human history. The first time in history that people were able to land on a different celestial body other than Earth. It's a huge achievement. On July 20th, 1969, the first human landed on the moon. And Neil Armstrong, the first person that actually stepped on the moon, in his famous words, said, "It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Now, there are some dispute when the space race actually ended. This moment, some argue, this is the moment, the first moon landing, where the US won the space race. Some argue that. Most people, however, argue that the space race actually ended a little bit later. It is not entirely clear. Some argue it ended at the end of the Apollo program. There were 6 more missions between 1969 until 1972 that landed on the moon. Most of them, Apollo 13, of course, did not land on the moon. Some argue that the space race ended in 1971 when Nixon canceled the moon program. And NASA's budget, as you can see from the graph below in the red, was cut severely from nearly 5% of the federal budget into something less than 0.5%. So NASA no longer had the money for huge, impressive projects. Some argue that the space race ended on May 26, 1972, as part of the SALT I talk, which is part of the detente, when the Soviet Union and the United States decided to come closer and talk and reduce the number of nuclear weapons. And some argue that the space race continued even longer up to 1975, when the Apollo and Soyuz met in space and the space race ended and a new era of space collaboration started. Let me know what you think and leave a comment. When do you think the space race actually ended? As you recall, we started this conversation with the progress in aviation. Our airplane in 1903, they were small and incapable, and then gradually they become stronger, bigger, faster, able to fly to a longer distance at a higher altitude and at a greater speed. And eventually we got spacecraft, and we were even able to land on the moon. Naturally, right after we landed on the moon, people assume the same progress, the same trend is going to continue at the same rate. And since this channel is called Science Sci-Fi, I'm going to shift gear and talk a little bit about science fiction. And we are going to review how science fiction in the late 1960s, early 1970s, thought the near future is going to look like. So here goes. We had in 1967, we had the TV series Lost in Space. We can see on the left side, on the right side. The TV series is talking about a family that got into a spacecraft called Jupiter, and they were part of a greater mission. There was something like a mothership capable of going to interstellar space, and yeah, the story was taking place in 1997. That means that in 1997, we were supposed to be able to fly to other star systems. Sounds awesome. 1967, Star Trek. You recall the episode with Khan? Yeah, Khan. The Enterprise found a sleeper ship called the SS Botany Bay that had Khan and other genetically engineered people. Not all of them were extremely nice or kind, but they were on a sleeper ship in interstellar space that was launched in 1996. Really awesome. That's awesome. I'm going to check my calendar. Maybe by 1996, we will have a spacecraft capable of going interstellar, even though it's sublight, a sleeper ship, but still going interstellar with a few dozen people. 1996. 1968, the movie 2001 Space Odyssey, based on a novel by Arthur C. Clarke by the same name, came out. In this movie, we had rotating space station with artificial gravity. We had a mission to Jupiter, human mission to Jupiter with artificial gravity. And this was supposed to take place in 2001. Awesome. Great. 1975, TV series, Space 1999. We will have a moon base in 1999. How wonderful. 1979, even James Bond in the movie Moonraker assumed that right then, or maybe only a few years after 1979, you're going to have a huge space station. Like, why not? We had brilliant future. Instead, what did we have? We have 50 years of stagnation. Now, I'm not saying that we were completely stagnated. NASA did have quite a few achievements, most of them related to unmanned mission and robotic mission. We have a series of very successful rovers landing on Mars. We have the Voyager and the Pioneer mission that went throughout the solar system, taking photos of Saturn, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. We had the New Horizons spacecraft traveling all the way to Pluto. We had the Huygens-Cassini mission to Saturn. We had the Hubble Space Telescope that was able to discover distant galaxy and a lot of interesting stuff. We had the other space telescope, like the Kepler, that was able to detect planets in other star system. But generally speaking, if you look at the high level, we're pretty much stagnated. Humanity total capacity, if you take all the companies and all the countries and all the nations, how much they are able to launch, how much payload to low Earth orbit, we are talking about something at around 500 tons per year. So the total capacity of humanity is only 500 tons per year of payload to space. Not very much. Also, we remain confined to low Earth orbit. We had a space station that fly around the Earth in orbit at around 450 or 500 kilometers. And that's as far as we can go. We can no longer go to the moon. We've been there in 1969. We cannot go now. We cannot go to Mars. We cannot go to Jupiter or to other star systems. We cannot do anything like that, like in the TV series. And the cost of launching payload to space, and up until recently, remained pretty high, around $10,000 per kilogram. So space is still very limited capacity to launch payload to space, and it's very expensive, and we can't go beyond low Earth orbit. That's pretty disappointing. But don't lose hope. Next week, we are going to talk about Space Race 2.0 and how this gloomy future is going to change for the better within the next decade or two. We're going to talk about SpaceX and other players and what's going on right now, how this paradigm of 50 years stagnation is in the process of changing. Now, before we end, I just want to talk about one more TV series that came out last year from All Mankind from Apple TV. It's an alternate history TV series that talk what would happen if the Soviets were the first to land on the moon, and the space race didn't end right then in the late 1960s or early 1970s. How our world would look like had the space race continued. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. That will really help me, and it also help other people to find the channel. So thank you very much for watching, and see you next week.